The sun had barely lifted above the rocky ridges surrounding Dry Creek when Clay Danner rode into town. The streets were mostly empty, except for the occasional shopkeeper unlocking a door or sweeping dust off the porch. Clay, perched tall in the saddle with his hat pulled low over tired eyes, didn't speak a word as he dismounted in front of the general store. He tied his horse boon to the rail and stretched the stiffness out of his legs. A routine morning in a life that hadn't changed in years. Clay wasn't a man known for warmth. Folks in town called him the quiet one, and not without reason. He kept to himself, ran his cattle ranch 3 miles out, and only came to town when he absolutely had to. Years ago, there'd been talk of a woman, a young schoolteacher he was set to marry, but then she vanished, and Clay had closed up, harder than a winter freeze. He was about to step up onto the porch of the store when he heard it, a whisper. "Will you buy this bread, sir?" The words were barely audible, like wind slipping through pine branches. Clay paused and turned, his boot heel scraping softly against the wood. There she stood, a little girl, no more than 7 or 8, stood beside the water barrel in the shade. She wore a patched dress that hung off her frame, her shoes scuffed and one lace dragging. She held out a bundle wrapped in a faded cloth flat, about the size of a loaf. Clay blinked. "Did you say something?" he asked more gruffly than he meant to. She swallowed, eyes wide but unwavering. "Mama says it's fresh. We baked it this morning. I can sell it for a nickel." Her voice was polite, careful, but there was something behind it, an old kind of quiet desperation that no child should carry. Clay knew that tone. He'd heard it in the voices of dying soldiers during the war, begging not for pain relief, but for someone to listen before they passed. He took a step closer. "What's your name?" he asked. The girl clutched the bundle tighter. "Ellie." "Sir," he nodded slowly. "Well, Miss Ellie, I reckon I could use some bread." She held out the cloth with both hands. He took it gently, the fabric warm from the sun and maybe from her small hands as well. Inside was a simple, golden brown loaf, carefully shaped and still faintly steaming. It wasn't much, but it smelled of home. The kind of bread you only made if you knew how to knead grief and love into the dough. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out not 1 coin, but 2. "Here," he said, holding them out. "This should cover it." Her eyes lit up for the briefest second. Not greedy, just surprised. She nodded shyly, clutching the coins like they were treasure. "Thank you, sir." Before he could say anything else, ask where she lived, who her folks were, she turned and walked away, disappearing around the side of the store like smoke and wind. Clay stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where she'd been. He unwrapped the bread slowly, the smell rising to meet him, yeast flour, a faint touch of honey or molasses, but it wasn't the scent that stopped him. It was the shape. The way the dough had been folded and scored. He'd seen it before, years ago. A woman named Maribeth used to bake bread like that, back when she was his whole future, back before she vanished without a trace. His hands gripped the loaf tighter, knuckles going white. His heart was thudding in a way it hadn't in years, not from fear, not from anger, but from something much older and deeper. Something he thought he'd buried long ago. Could it be? Could Ellie? He looked down the street again, but the girl was gone. He scanned the alleys, the porches, the storefronts, but Dry Creek had swallowed her whole. Still clutching the warm loaf, Clay Danner turned from the store and climbed back into the saddle, bread tucked carefully into his saddlebag. He didn't need his supplies anymore. He needed answers, and he had a feeling they were wrapped in a cloth that smelled of home and held by a child who looked far too much like the woman he once loved. Clay Danner didn't ride straight home that morning. The bread sat beside him in the saddlebag like a living thing, still warm, still heavy with meaning. His mind played tricks on him as Boone's hooves clopped slowly over the cracked dirt road. The girl's voice echoed in his ears. "Will, you buy this bread, sir?" It wasn't just the bread, it was how it was made. The slight twist in the center, the faint pattern of a rose etched with a butter knife across the top crust. Maribeth used to do that. Always said a loaf should look as good as it tasted. Clay hadn't seen bread made like that since she left. No one in this county baked that way. No one but her. He turned Boone around and headed back into town. By the time he returned, the street was a little busier. A wagon was unloading crates outside the Mercantile. Two young boys raced past chasing a dog. Clay dismounted and approached the alley where the girl had vanished, but she wasn't there. He checked behind the water barrel. Nothing. He walked. The boardwalk, peeking into the bakery, the apothecary, even behind the church. "You seen a little girl?" he asked a shopkeeper. "Selling bread?" The man scratched his head. "Can't say I have. Plenty of folks selling things but bread." "No. You think she's in trouble?" "I'm not sure," Clay muttered. And that was the truth. He stopped outside the sheriff's office, considering whether to ask there, when a voice called from the livery stable behind him. "Looking for someone, Danner?" It was Jed Thorne, the stable hand. A lanky, sunburned young man with more ears than tact. He was always the first to know who rode into town and the last to let it go. "I might be," Clay said. "Little girl. Maybe 7, maybe 8. Offered me bread this morning." Jed frowned thoughtfully. "Ain't seen no girl like that, but yesterday I saw a woman and a child sneaking out behind the old depot. They didn't look local." "Where at the depot?" Clay asked. His voice sharpening. Jed pointed with a pitchfork. "Little shack behind it, one they used for telegraph storage years ago. Been abandoned since the fire." Clay nodded once and turned. The shack was hidden by tall weeds and years of neglect. Its tin roof sagged and a few boards hung loose from the door frame. Still, as he approached, he saw a wisp of smoke curling up from the chimney. Someone was inside. He knocked once. Silence. He knocked again, this time softer. "It's Clay Danner," he said gently. The bread was good. For a moment, there was no sound than the faintest shuffle of feet. The door creaked open just enough to show a pair of tired eyes peeking through. It was the little girl. She recognized him and hesitated, then stepped aside without a word. Inside, it was dim but clean. A cot in the corner. A worn blanket stretched over what looked like a pallet on the floor. The smell of flour and smoke lingered in the air. And there, by the small iron stove, sat a woman hunched in a rocking chair. Her skin was pale. Her hair, once golden, had dulled. But Clay knew her instantly. Maribeth. His breath caught. She didn't rise, didn't speak, just looked at him with eyes full of time and sorrow. "I thought you were dead," he said finally. "I almost was," she whispered. The little girl stood between them, one hand gently resting on her mother's arm, the other holding a tin cup. "She's sick," Ellie said quietly. "But she made the bread. I just sell it." Clay crouched in front of her, his voice barely above a breath. "You did good, Ellie. That bread, it brought me back." The girl looked confused but said nothing. Maribeth coughed lightly, a weak sound that scraped like dry leaves. "I didn't know how else to reach you," she said. "I didn't even know if you'd still be here." Clay's chest ached with a dozen questions and no idea where to start. He stood slowly, eyes locked on hers. "I never stopped wondering," he said. "Never stopped hurting." Maribeth nodded. "Me too." Clay looked around the tiny shack. At the makeshift kitchen, the stack of wood, the patched quilts. She'd made do with nothing, raised a daughter, baked bread, survived. He turned to Ellie. "How'd you get the flour?" "I traded kindling for it," she said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. That was when Clay Danner knew one thing. For certain he wasn't going to let them spend another night here. Not while he had an entire ranch sitting, empty just 3 miles away. The sun dipped low as Clay Danner led Boone along the narrow trail that curved behind Dry Creek's old depot, Ellie walking beside him with a basket in hand. Her mother, Maribeth, rode slowly behind them on Boone's saddle, bundled in Clay's coat, her arms wrapped around her frail frame. Clay walked at her side like a quiet sentinel, steady and silent, ready to catch her if she so much as swayed. He hadn't said much since they left the shack. The silence wasn't cold, it was heavy with all the unspoken years between them. He hadn't asked why she left. Not yet. Not when she looked like a stiff wind could carry her away. When they reached the ranch gate, Ellie looked up in awe. The Danner Ranch was tucked in a wide valley of golden grass and tall cottonwoods, with the house nestled against the rise of the hills. A barn, a corral, and 2 outbuildings sat in quiet waiting. "This is all yours?" Ellie asked, almost in a whisper. Clay gave a single nod. "It's home, or it was. Been real quiet the last few years." Maribeth shifted slightly on the saddle. "Looks the same." He glanced at her, startled. "You've been here before?" She gave a soft smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Once, you were working cattle, and I rode past on the stagecoach. Didn't stop, just looked." Clay swallowed hard and helped her down from the horse, steadying her with both hands. She leaned against him for just a second longer than necessary. And he didn't move. Inside the house, it smelled faintly of cedar, dust, and old tobacco. Everything was neat. Clay was nothing if not orderly but cold, unlived in. Maribeth took a seat by the fireplace while Ellie explored with wide eyes, peeking into the parlor and marveling at the books lining the shelves. Clay lit the fire and started heating water. He moved like a man doing something for the 100th time, but his hands shook slightly. Not from fear, but from the feeling he couldn't yet name. "Where's the doctor?" he asked, finally. Maribeth shook her head. "We couldn't afford one. I've had fevers, off and on, but I'll be fine." "You're not fine," he said flatly. "You're burning up. You don't have to lie to me." She looked at him, eyes soft. Old habits. He didn't push further. Instead, he turned and walked out the door without another word. An hour later, he was back with Doc Keller in tow. The doctor, a man in his 60s with silver hair and a permanent smell of pipe smoke, examined Maribeth in silence. Clay waited outside the bedroom with Ellie, who sat on the stairs with her hands clasped in her lap. "Is my mama gonna be okay?" she asked quietly. Clay crouched beside her. "We're gonna do everything we can. But you don't have to worry about where your next loaf's coming from anymore. You hear me?" Ellie nodded solemnly. When the doctor finally emerged, he looked grim. "She's not dying," he said. "But she's weak in infection that went too long without treatment. She need rest, real food, and warmth." "You got medicine in that cabinet?" Clay nodded. "Then I'll leave you with a list. She's lucky you came when you did." Clay thanked him and saw him out, then returned to the sitting room where Maribeth had been moved to the couch. She looked better already, with a bit of color returning to her cheeks. "You didn't have to do all this," she murmured. "I did," Clay replied. "You don't get to vanish and then pretend like you're just another stranger passing through." She looked down. "I didn't vanish. I ran. Why?" She hesitated, then said it flatly. "Because my father said if I married you, he'd kill you." Clay's face went pale. The old man, Judge Rowan, had always hated him. Called him a ranch hand, a mongrel, a bastard. But Clay never knew the threat had gone that far. "So you left to protect me?" he asked. "I was young, scared, pregnant, and too proud to ask for help." She met his gaze. "I thought I was doing the right thing. Then it all went wrong." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Clay said, his voice gentler than she'd ever heard it, "I didn't know. About her. About you. If I had, I would have moved heaven and earth to find you." Tears welled in her eyes. "I know that now." From the stairs, Ellie called, "Mama, I found a brush." Maribeth laughed softly, the sound like cracked porcelain. "Beginning to mend. Looks like someone's already making herself at home." Clay looked toward the little girl and then back to Maribeth. "So should you," he said. And for the first time in years, his house didn't feel so quiet. The next morning dawned with pale gold sunlight stretching across the Danner Ranch. Fog clung to the trees beyond the pasture, and dew sparkled along the fence rails like tiny bits of silver. Inside the house, Clay stood at the kitchen stove, pouring hot coffee into 2 mugs. One for himself and one for her. He moved through the house quietly, the smell of bacon and fresh eggs already drifting down the hall. Maribeth was resting in the front room, bundled under a quilt. He hadn't let her sleep in the drafty guest room, not when she was still fevered. Ellie was curled on the rug nearby, scribbling in a notebook she'd found in Clay's desk. "Mama said your handwriting's neater than hers," Ellie said cheerfully, not looking up. Clay gave a half smile. "Your mama always rushed through things when she was nervous." Maribeth stirred, blinking, slowly awake. "That's because you always stood behind me while I wrote, like a hawk." "You never misspelled a thing," he said, handing her the coffee. She accepted it gratefully. "Because I was too scared to." A soft laugh passed between them. But beneath it, the silence was thick with more important words left unsaid. Clay sat down across from her. "You told me last night you ran because of your father, that he threatened me." Maribeth looked down into the coffee cup. "He didn't just threaten you. He said he'd ruin you, have your land seized, accuse you of theft. He was a judge back then, Clay, a powerful one. He knew how to twist the law like it was paper in his hand." Clay's jaw clenched. "You should have told me. I would have fought him." "I was scared you'd try," she said, her voice cracking. "And I believed he'd win." Clay leaned back, staring out the window for a long moment. The past hadn't died. It had just gone quiet until now. "Is he still alive?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "Yes. He moved back east a few years ago. I heard he was sick, but knowing him, he's the kind of man that doesn't die easy." Clay stood and paced across the room, boots echoing on the wooden floor. "If he knows about Ellie—" "He doesn't," Maribeth said quickly. "I never told anyone her father's name. Not in all these years. Not once." Clay turned too. Look at Ellie, who was now flipping through the pages of a book, mouthing the words to herself. So small, so full of fire, and completely unaware of the kind of man who might claim to be her grandfather. "You shouldn't have had to do this alone," he said softly. Maribeth's eyes shimmered. "I thought about coming back so many times, but I was afraid you'd moved on, that I'd already broken you once." "You did," he said plainly. Then his voice softened. "But somehow I kept waking up every morning anyway." Maribeth nodded, tears slipping quietly down her cheeks. Clay stepped closer and knelt beside her. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. Not of him, not of the past." "I don't know how to stop looking over my shoulder," she whispered. Then, "Stop looking," he said. "Start living." Later that afternoon, Clay rode into town alone. He needed information, and if anyone still had dirt on old Judge Rowan, it'd be Sheriff Henley. The sheriff sat behind his desk, polishing his badge like it actually mattered. "What brings you here, Danner?" he asked, not even looking up. "I need to know if Judge Rowan's made contact with anyone in Dry Creek, or if anyone's seen him." Henley looked up sharply. "That snake? Not in years. Why?" "No reason," Clay lied. "Just came across the name." Henley narrowed his eyes. "What's this about?" Let's just say he's part of a past I'd hoped was gone for good. The sheriff leaned back in his chair. Well, the man made enemies everywhere he went. If he is sniffing around these parts again, I'll hear about it, and so will you. Clay tipped his hat and walked out, but as he mounted Boone, a chill crept through his spine. The past had teeth, and if Judge Rowan found out his daughter was alive with a child, that man wouldn't rest. Clay rode hard back to the ranch, a storm of thoughts in his head. Whatever came next, one thing was certain: he wasn't letting anything, or anyone, tear them apart again. Now, not ever. Clay Danner had lived a quiet life, but never a peaceful one. Now, with Maribeth resting in his front room and Ellie humming as she swept the porch outside, something like peace hovered, fragile, unfamiliar, but real. It felt like a song he'd once known by heart, but hadn't heard in years. He watched Ellie through the kitchen window as she pushed the broom like it was a sword, battling invisible dust dragons. Her hair caught the sunlight, and for the first time, Clay allowed himself to truly see it. The same golden strands her mother had, the same steady focus, and when she laughed, a glimmer of someone else entirely. Himself. He poured hot milk into a mug and brought it out to her. "Careful," he said. "It's warm." She took it with both hands. "Thank you. You don't have to do chores," he added, half smiling. "I like it. Makes the place shine." She took a long sip, then looked up at him. "Mama says you were a cowboy." Clay tilted his head. "That so?" "She said you had the steadiest hands she ever saw. That you fixed fences faster than thunder." He chuckled. "Thunder don't fix fences, but I'll take the compliment." Ellie grinned, then glanced toward the barn. "Can I see your horse?" "Boone?" "Sure." He walked with her to the corral, where the old gelding snorted a soft greeting. Ellie stepped up and offered him a piece of biscuit from her pocket. Boone accepted it like royalty, bowing his head slightly. "Can I ride him?" Clay hesitated. "You ever been on a horse before?" "No, but I won't fall." He watched her, small, eager, entirely certain. "You can sit on him. For now." He lifted her carefully into the saddle, his big hand steady beneath her. She sat tall, proud, gripping the pommel. "Like this?" she asked. "Like a natural," he said. And he meant it. She turned to him with a sudden question. "Did you know me before?" The word struck him like a lasso around the chest. "No," he said quietly. "I didn't know you existed. But now that I do, I'm not likely to forget." That night, the house was warmer than it had been in years, not just from the fire crackling in the hearth, but from the soft sounds of life. Ellie was curled up with Boone's old saddle blanket, fast asleep beside the fire. Maribeth sat on the couch, her skin still pale but her eyes brighter. Clay brought her a bowl of stew and a warm roll. She accepted it gratefully. "I never thought we'd sit like this again," she said. "I did," he replied. "Every day I rode the fences. Every time I sat at that table, I waited." "I'm sorry I stayed gone so long," she whispered. "You didn't deserve that." He shook his head. "You did what you thought you had to. You kept her safe." "I tried," she said. "But there were nights I couldn't feed her, days I was too sick to get out of bed. And she took care of me. Can you imagine that? A little girl keeping me alive." "She's tough," Clay said. "Got it from her mama." She smiled faintly. "And maybe her father." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "She deserves more than a bed on the floor, more than a basket of bread and hope that someone will buy it. You both do." Maribeth looked at him carefully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying this is your home now. As long as you want it. No running, no hiding, not anymore." Emotion trembled in her eyes. "You're sure?" "I've never been more sure of anything." They sat in silence, watching the firelight flicker across the old pine walls. Outside, a cold wind howled across the valley, rattling the eaves. But inside there was warmth. there was safety. There was something beginning to bloom again. Clay looked over at Ellie, her mouth slightly open in sleep, one arm wrapped around a pillow like it was a promise. "She doesn't know yet," Maribeth said softly, "about you. That you're her father. She doesn't need to know right now," he replied. "She just needs to feel safe, wanted." "She already does," Maribeth whispered, "because of you." Clay stared into the fire and felt something deep in his chest shift, like a broken fence post finally pulled upright. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. And for the first time in years, he meant it with every part of himself. By the time the first flakes began to fall, the valley was already wrapped in a strange, breathless stillness. The sky had turned the color of wet ash, and the cottonwood trees stood like sentries, their golden leaves shivering in the wind. Clay stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching the horizon with a rancher's eye. Snow in October wasn't unheard of, but snow with that kind of sky? That was a warning. Behind him, the door creaked open. Maribeth stepped out, wrapped in a wool shawl he dug out of storage. She looked stronger. There was color in her cheeks now, and her steps no longer trembled. But she still carried the caution of someone who'd been on the edge too long. "Snow's coming," Clay muttered. She followed his gaze. "Hard to believe it. Just last week we were sweating over firewood." He turned toward her. "I'm going into town. If this turns bad, we'll be stuck out here for days. You and Ellie stay close to the fire. There's kindling stacked by the hearth. You don't have to do this alone anymore," she said quietly. Clay looked at her, then nodded once. "I'll be back by sundown." But he wasn't. The storm came faster than even Clay expected. By the time he rode back with sacks of flour, beans, and dried meat tied to Boone's saddle, the wind had shifted hard out of the north. Snow wasn't just falling, it was slamming, thick and blinding. He was still 2 miles out when the trail vanished beneath white. Back at the ranch, Maribeth paced near the fire, glancing at the window every time the wind rattled the glass. Ellie tried to stay calm, reading a book in the corner, but her eyes darted to the door with every gust. "Do you think he got lost?" she whispered. "No," Maribeth said firmly, kneeling in front of her daughter. "Clay knows this land like he knows his own hands. He's coming." But deep down, Maribeth was worried too. What if Boone slipped? What if Clay had to make camp in the cold? What if the past had already taken too much, and she was about to lose him all over again? Just before midnight, the storm reached its peak. Snow piled high against the windows. The wind screamed down the chimney. Then, through the blinding white a pounding at the door, Maribeth flung it open, and there he was, half covered in snow. Boone panting behind him, saddlebags soaked but intact. "You're freezing," she gasped, helping him inside. "I'm fine," he said through chattering teeth. "Got caught by the creek. Had to cross on foot. Nearly lost the flour." "You're insane," she muttered, brushing snow from his shoulders. "Why didn't you wait it out?" He looked at her, snow melting in his beard. "You and Ellie were here alone. That wasn't an option." She didn't answer, just wrapped her arms around him and held on. For a long time. The next morning, the world outside had gone quiet again. The storm had buried everything in white. Trees bent low under the weight. The fences were half invisible. But inside the house, warmth radiated from the stone fireplace, and the scent of cinnamon and hot bread filled the air. Ellie was in the kitchen with Maribeth, helping knead a new batch of dough. Clay sat at the table, bandaging a shallow cut on his hand from a broken stirrup buckle. Ellie looked up at him. "You brought the flour just in time." Clay gave her a small smile. "Had to make sure your bread stayed the best in the valley." "You almost froze," she said bluntly. He shrugged. "Worth it." Maribeth met his eyes across the room. There was something new there, knout rust that had once been broken, slowly stitching itself whole again. Later that evening, after Ellie had gone to bed, Clay and Maribeth sat before the fire with steaming mugs between them. "I've been thinking," he said. "Dangerous," she teased, smiling. "I want you both to stay. Not just for the storm. For good." Maribeth went still. "Clay, I know you're afraid of what comes next, but Ellie needs a home. A real one. And I want to be that for her. For you." She looked down, tears welling in her eyes. "You're sure?" He reached for her hand. "More than I've ever been about anything." Outside, snow continued to fall in soft silence. Inside, hearts long frozen began to thaw. The snow had melted slowly over the next 2 weeks, dripping from the eaves like a soft, steady clock. The valley shed its white coat and returned to its usual golden-brown calm. Life at the Danner Ranch had taken on a rhythm simple, steady, and for the first time in years, joyful. Clay mended fences with a lightness in his chest he hadn't felt since boyhood. Ellie helped collect eggs from the coop, her apron pockets filled with feathers and laughter. Maribeth baked daily, her hands growing stronger, her voice returning like a bird that had flown home at last. But peace is a fragile thing on the frontier. It came undone with the sound of hooves on packed earth, slow, deliberate, and too heavy. For any local rancher, Clay stepped onto the porch, wiping his hands on a rag. The rider approaching down the long dirt road wasn't just a traveler. He sat tall in the saddle, draped in a long dark coat, with boots that hadn't seen ranch work. His horse was sleek, too clean. A man from the city. As he drew closer, Clay's stomach sank. The man tipped his hat and stopped at the gate. "Clay Danner?" "I am," Clay said evenly. The man didn't dismount. "Name's Garrett Rowan. I believe my daughter is living under your roof." Clay's jaw tensed. "You've got a lot of nerve riding in here unannounced." "I didn't come to cause trouble," Garrett said smoothly. "Only to speak with Maribeth and to meet my granddaughter." Clay crossed his arms. "You abandoned them, drove her out. You don't get to show up years later and pretend you're family." Garrett smiled thinly. Maribeth was confused back then. "She made some poor decisions, but I've changed. I'm dying, Danner. I came to make things right." Behind him, the screen door creaked open. Maribeth stood there, pale as the snow that had just melted. Her eyes locked on her father, and in an instant, Clay saw every scar ripple beneath her skin. "Get off this land," she said, her voice steady but hollow. Garrett looked surprised. "That's no way to greet your father." "You're no father to me," she said. "You threatened the man I loved. You forced me to flee in the middle of the night. And you never once tried to find out if I was alive, or if Ellie was." "I didn't know about the girl," he said. "You think I'd have let my own blood live in a shack like a stray? I came to take her with me. She deserves more than this." Clay stepped forward fast. "You're not taking her anywhere." Garrett's voice grew cold. "Legally, I can challenge for guardianship. I still have connections, a name, a record of your past. Especially hers." Maribeth stepped down from the porch, her voice fierce now. "Try it. Just try it. You may have power back east, but out here, Clay is the one who stood by us, protected us, gave us hope again." Garrett's face twisted into something bitter. "So that's how it is." "That's exactly how it is," Clay said. "Now you've got 10 seconds to turn that horse around before I throw you off this land myself." Garrett hesitated, his eyes narrowing, calculating, searching for weakness. But he saw none. Not in Clay, not in Maribeth, not even in the small figure now standing in the doorway, clutching a doll and watching him with wide, wary eyes. His face softened. Just for a moment, then he nodded once and turned the horse. "I'll be staying in Dry Creek for a few days," he said. "Think on what's best for the child." "She's not yours to decide for," Maribeth said through gritted teeth. "She never was." Garrett rode off, the wind catching his coat like a shroud. That night the house was quiet. Clay sat by the fire, his rifle leaning against the wall. "He's not gone for good," Maribeth said softly from across the room. "He's planning something. I know it." Clay didn't look away from the flames. "Then we'll be ready." Maribeth walked over, kneeling beside his chair. "If he pushes this, if it comes to a court, he might have a case. He's rich. Connected." Clay turned toward her. "So am I. Maybe not in the ways he is, but I've got land. I've got a name in this town. And I've got the truth. That counts for something." She searched his face for doubt and found none. "I'm not letting him take her," he said again. "You've both come too far." And for the rest of the night he didn't sleep, because some things were worth losing everything to protect. Following morning, Maribeth rose early. She hadn't slept much, not with her father's threats echoing in her mind. But something inside her had shifted. She was tired of fear, tired of hiding, and more than anything, she was tired of letting other people write her story. She stood in the kitchen kneading dough by hand, just as she had done back when it was the only way she could feed Ellie. Only this time she wasn't baking to survive. She was baking to reclaim something. Clay entered the kitchen quietly, shirt half buttoned, boots in one hand. He paused when he saw her at the counter, sleeves rolled up, fingers deep in flour. "You're up early," he said. She didn't look up. "Ellie and I are going into town," Clay blinked. "What for?" "We're bringing bread. The good kind. The kind Judge Rowan used to tell me was fit for servants." Her eyes flicked up. "I want to sell every loaf right in front of the Dry Creek courthouse." Clay set his boots down slowly. "You sure?" "No." She smiled faintly. "But I'm done running." By late morning, Maribeth and Ellie stood on the boardwalk outside the Dry Creek General Store, a basket of warm bread loaves between them. Townsfolk passed curiously, some pausing to sample, others lingering with kind words. "You're the one who's staying with Clay Danner, aren't you?" asked a gray-haired woman who tasted a slice and nodded with approval. "We haven't had bread like this since Miss Emery moved away." "Yes, ma'am," Maribeth replied calmly, "and Ellie and I are here to stay." That last line wasn't just polite conversation, it was a declaration, a quiet challenge. And she hoped one man in town would hear it. He did. Judge Garrett Rowan emerged from the Dry Creek Hotel around noon, dressed in black wool and a wide-brimmed hat. He spotted the crowd first, then the bread. "Then her, Maribeth," he said, approaching like a snake sliding through brush. "Causing a scene already, I see." She turned toward him, wiping her hands on her apron. "Selling bread isn't a crime, even in your eyes." His lips curled. "Is this supposed to be some kind of statement?" "No, it's just breakfast for half the town," she said. "But I suppose if it feels like a statement to you, that's on your conscience." Garrett's jaw flexed. "You're drawing attention. I'm drawing support," she corrected. "From people who know Clay, who trust him, and who will vouch for him in any hearing you dare to start." "Maribeth," he said lowly, stepping closer, "you've always been foolish, but this is reckless. You don't win in court with bread." "No," she said calmly, "but I remind people what I've had to do to survive. I remind them I didn't raise Ellie in bitterness. I raised her with love and hard work, and that she belongs with the man who's kept her safe without ever asking for anything in return." He laughed bitterly. "You always were sentimental, and you always were afraid of anyone who stood up to you." The tension shattered when Ellie stepped between them, holding out a half loaf wrapped in brown paper. "You can have some," she said innocently. Garrett stared at her. His granddaughter, his blood. He didn't reach for the bread, just looked at her, speechless. Then, quietly, Ellie said, "Mama said not everyone who shares your name deserves your heart. I think I understand that now." "For the first time, Garrett." Rowan had no retort, no authority. No legal threat that didn't feel hollow in the face of a little girl offering him kindness he hadn't earned. He turned without another word and walked back into the hotel. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the mountains, Clay stood on the porch as Maribeth and Ellie returned. Their basket was empty. Their faces were flushed from wind and victory. "She did it," Ellie beamed. "Mama sold all the bread." Clay smiled. "I don't doubt it." Maribeth approached him slowly. "He's leaving town. You're sure?" "He packed his things this afternoon. Didn't even finish his rooming bill." Clay studied her. "How do you feel?" She took a deep breath. Free. He opened his arms. "Come here, then." She stepped into them, letting herself rest against him. And for the first time, there was no shadow standing between them. Later that night, Maribeth wrote something on a small scrap of paper and tucked it into the family Bible. Clay noticed it but didn't ask. She handed it to him after supper. He opened it. It simply read, "This time I stayed." The wind was gentler now, the kind that carried spring on its back even though winter still lingered in the mornings. Dry Creek was coming alive again, muddy roads drying out, windows flung open to air out the cold months, and children laughing. In the alleys between buildings. Ellie, Danner she'd started calling herself, now ran down Main Street with a basket full of warm rolls and a note pinned to her shawl. It read, "Take one. Tell your neighbor." It was Maribeth's idea, and Clay had built the tiny bread stand outside the Mercantile with his own hands, sturdy, with a sign that simply said, "Baked by Ellie and her mama." What began as survival had become something else entirely. Bread wasn't just food, now it was an introduction, a way of saying, "We're here. We belong." And the town had answered. Mrs. Punner at the schoolhouse offered Ellie a place among the spring term students. Reverend Dobbins brought them eggs in exchange for loaves. Even rough old Jed Thorne at the livery started asking Ellie to braid his rope ends when she visited with biscuits in her pocket. Clay watched it all from the porch, pipe unlit, coffee in hand, boots muddy from mending fence posts. But his eyes never strayed far from that little girl. She was his. He hadn't said it out loud, not yet. And Maribeth hadn't pushed it. But something unspoken passed between them each time he helped Ellie down from the saddle or tucked her in at night. Fatherhood didn't need permission. It simply was. That night, after supper, Ellie stood at the hearth staring into the low-burning fire. "Can I ask you something?" she said without turning. Clay set down his mug. "Course." "Do I have a real father?" The question wasn't bitter. It wasn't sad. It was soft. Like she already knew the answer and just needed it said out loud. Clay walked over and crouched beside her. "You do," he said. "You always have. Is it you?" she asked, turning now. He didn't smile, didn't joke. He simply placed his hand over hers. "Yes." Ellie nodded once, no tears. Just a long breath, as though a piece of her had always known and could finally rest. "I hoped so," she whispered. "Because you don't just look like me, you see me. Mama said that's how you know someone loves you." Clay's throat thickened. He blinked and cleared it gently. "Then I reckon I've loved you from the moment you handed me that loaf." The next Sunday, the three of them entered the church together. Ellie held Clay's hand. Maribeth wore the blue shawl he'd given her after the storm. Heads turned. But not in judgment, only in quiet, warm surprise. Pastor Dobbins stepped down from the pulpit to greet them. "Brother Danner," he said, "it's been some time." Clay nodded. "Been a long road." Dobbins turned to Maribeth and Ellie, and a beautiful family at the end of it. Ellie stepped forward and held out a roll. "We brought breakfast." Laughter rippled through the church. They sat together. In the third pew, not at the back like visitors, not at the front like dignitaries. Just together, belonging. During the sermon, Ellie leaned over and whispered, "What's our last name again?" Clay looked at her, then at Maribeth beside him. "Danner," he said, and she smiled like that word had weight and wings at the same time. That evening, Clay carved their initials into the beam over the hearth. C+M+E. Not as a decoration. Not as a monument. As proof of a story that had started with a whisper and a warm loaf of bread and had grown into something lasting. The land had begun to bloom. Spring stretched herself across the valley in shades of soft green and sun-warmed gold. Wildflowers edged the trail, and birds nested high in the cottonwoods. Life at the Danner Ranch had settled into something steady, unspoken, and beautiful. But Clay Danner had one more thing to do, something he'd carried in his chest for too long. It was late afternoon when he saddled Boone and packed a small basket. Not tools, not supplies. Just a blanket, a mason jar of lemonade, and a ring that had been locked in his desk drawer for years. "Think you say yes?" Ellie asked as she watched him cinch the saddle tight. Clay turned to her, surprised. "You knew?" Ellie grinned. "Mama talks in her sleep." Clay laughed, a sound deep and full. "Well then," he said, "what if she says no?" Ellie tilted her head. "She won't." He found Maribeth by the corral, brushing Boone's tail with practiced hands. She'd grown stronger each week, and though her past still lived in the lines around her eyes, there was light there now, earned light. Clay held out a hand. "Ride with me?" She looked at him, curious. "Where to?" "Somewhere quiet." They rode west, toward the ridge above the pasture, where wildflowers grew thick and the wind ran free. Boone's hooves moved slow and steady, the silence between them comfortable. When they reached the rise, Clay helped her down, laid the blanket beneath an old tree, and sat beside her. "You remember this place?" he asked. She looked around, surprised. "This is where we kissed the first time." "And where you told me you loved me," Clay added. "Right before you ran." Her smile faded a little. "I never stopped loving you. I just stopped believing I could have you." He turned toward her now, something shining in his eyes. "I still remember the way you looked that night. Hair full of burrs, dirt on your dress. But you smiled like the whole world could wait." She reached out, brushing a leaf from his collar. "And now? Now I want the world to stop." He pulled a small box from his coat pocket, opened it slowly, and held it out. Inside was a silver ring, simple, engraved with a rose. Maribeth gasped, fingers trembling. "Clay, I had it made the week you left," he said. Been waiting a long time to ask the question. He looked up, voice low and certain. "Will you marry me, Maribeth Rowan? Will you stay not just in this house, not just in this valley, but in my life, for good?" Tears spilled from her eyes before she could speak. She nodded, laughing and crying all at once. "Yes, yes, I will." Clay slipped the ring onto her finger. She held his face in her hands and kissed him under the wide blue sky. The wedding was held 3 weeks later, out in the pasture with neighbors gathered and wildflowers woven into Maribeth's hair. Ellie stood between them, proud and grinning, her dress sewn by half the women in Dry Creek. As the vows were spoken, Ellie reached for both their hands, sealing the circle between them. When the preacher asked if anyone objected, Jed Thorne whispered, "They'd better not." Laughter rippled through the guests. Afterward, they danced beneath lanterns strung from trees. Ellie fell asleep in Clay's arms, her head on his shoulder as the music slowed. Maribeth watched them with quiet wonder. Later that night, Clay carried Ellie to her bed, then returned to Maribeth standing alone on the porch. He wrapped his arms around her, rested his chin on her head. "I told you I'd wait," he whispered. "I told you I'd come back," she replied. Above them, stars blinked gently over the ranch. The same ranch where Payne had once lived. Where? Ghosts had once walked. Now it was filled with light, laughter, bread rising in the oven, and the sound of a little girl calling two people by the names they were always meant to carry: Mama, Daddy.